Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Lamed. This week's learning is sponsored by the Miller-Rotenberg family in loving memory of their daughter, Taniel Miller, on her 21st yahrzeit. We honor and celebrate her memory by continuing the path she forged, keeping her love of community, chesed, Israel, and learning alive and vibrant. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy Schwartz in loving memory of her mother, Shirley K. Tidor, Sarah Rezel Bat Mordechai Yitzchak, and Frida Sima, and her grandmother, Esther Bat Sinai and Chaya, who share a yahrzeit. My grandmother died of typhus in the Lodge ghetto. My mother, who never knew her mother-in-law, had the zchut of dying in Eretz Yisrael. I knew one, am named for the other, love them both, and carry their essence in me. May their holy neshamot have an aliyah. Okay, we're going to get started today with the top of our daf of Idach. Before we start, I'm just going to mention that a shir went up of Gethet yesterday from Rabbi Shimon about why Moshe struggled with understanding how to build the parts of the Mishkan that we talked about, right, of the menorah. What was the struggle with the building of the menorah that God needed to show him exactly what it looked like? Okay, so if you want to delve into that in more depth, also on the Hebrew side, Rav Kahana had a shir all about the importance of Torah Shebaal Peh, the complicated nature, the challenges of Torah Shebaal Peh, as we saw in the story of Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Akiva. So if your Hebrew is good and you want to listen to that shir, that's also recommended listening. Okay, we're going to get started. We started yesterday with Rav Yosef, who said there's two statements that Rav made that were contradicted by braita. So now we're going to see what the second one was. We dealt with the first one, and they both had to do with Sefer Torah, and we're going to continue our topic of Sefer Torah today, although we will diverge at the end into completely different topics. Idach de Amar Rav. So the second one that Rav said that was contradicted by a braita, and I'm going to already tell you from right now, we're going to try to reconcile it with the braita, but we're going to be left with some confusion depending on how you read the Gemara about whether in the end you can reconcile Rav with the braita or you can't. Okay, and then we'll talk about if you can't, well, how does that work? Don't Amoraim always have to work in Tanaitic sources, so we'll get back to that. So, Idach de Amar Rav, HaKotev Sefer Torah u'ba ligmor, gomer va'afilu be'emtza hadaf. When you're writing a Sefer Torah and you're finishing it, so you can finish even in the middle of a page. Okay, it doesn't have to go to the bottom of the page. Now, how can you force something to go to the bottom of the page? Well, okay, today's going to be all about typesetting and, how to set up the pages in the Torah. And, in the time before computers, there was still an issue of, where do you put the margins? Where do you, what can be put in the margins? What can't? How do you double space, single space, 1.5? Okay, we're going to have all these kind of questions about a Sefer Torah. So he says when you're finishing, you don't have to try to figure out, right, that the whole thing's going to end at the very bottom of the page. Meitive. Now this contradicts a Tanaitic source. I will point out that this source appears in Masechet Sofrim. Masechet Sofrim is one of these things called the Masechtot HaKtanot. There's all sorts of small Masechtot, like Avoto Rabbi Natan, and there's a whole bunch of them. One of them is Masechet Sofrim, which is all about Sofrim, okay, like Sefer Torah, laws of writing Sefer Torah. They're generally assumed to be, according to the academics, written around the 8th century, which is much later than Tanaitic material, which was written in the 1st and 2nd century. So, which is just interesting in and of itself. And here it's quoted as a braita. You could say that perhaps Masechet Sofrim is a collection of earlier braitot. And we happen to have it appears in Masechet Sofrim. When they were talking about it was more some external source. There wasn't any book yet. Okay, anyway, also just by the way, just to understand, right, the Gemara was finished, at least the first editing of the Gemara, in the 6th century. And then later stuff was added by the Sforaim, but it seems like this was the basic sugya that was added before because it was Rav Yosef talking already in the time of the Amoraim when Masechet Sofrim didn't yet exist. But again, it was likely a braita that ended up later in Masechet Sofrim. So anyway, with that, it's just interesting to know what Masechet Sofrim is. You can Google it and read more information about it. Okay. Sefer Torah balo ligmor. So when you're writing a Sefer Torah and you want to finish, lo yigamor be'emtza hadaf kederech shegomer b'chumashim. Okay, the way you end other books of the Torah, you can end in the middle of a page, but you can't end Sefer Torah in the middle of a page. Okay, that goes completely against what Rav said. Rav said you can end in the middle of a page. What do? You make much more narrow columns. You have 2 lines on a column or something like that. And in fact, Rashi says, what does it mean, mekatzer v'holech? If you have Rashi, basically there's a picture in Rashi, if you're looking at a regular Gemara, and it's angled like a triangle going down. Okay, so you basically have a triangle, like that goes down, and every line goes in a little bit, until you get to the last line, and you have, kind of looks like one word at the last line. So he says basically you have to end at the end of the page. Okay, the Rambam has a different interpretation. The Rambam says it's more like a right-angled triangle, that basically the first line is a long line. Every line gets shorter, until you end right. It's right justified, basically. And Rashi is centered. That's the easiest way to say it, right? Rashi just takes less words on every line going down and centered. And the Rambam is everything right justified, also less words on every line in order to get down to the bottom. So there's a debate about how exactly this works. But he says you can even, right, so the Rav says you can finish in the middle of the page, and according to this braita, it seems very clear you have to finish at the end of the page and you have to arrange the words properly so that you end up getting to the end of the page. So the answer, no, we have an answer. Kika Amar Rav b'chumashim. Rav was talking about in a Chumash. Okay, in the other books you could finish. So now they say, right, so when he says, Kotev Sefer Torah, Bali Gemara, if you want to finish a book, right, Breshit, Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, you can finish in the middle of a page, but not Devarim. Vaha Sefer Torah Kamal, but he says, if you're writing a Sefer Torah and you want to finish sounds like finish the Sefer Torah. It doesn't sound like finish one of the Chumashim. So they say, B'chumashim shel Sefer Torah. We don't really recognize this because we don't really have this. But in those days, right, they didn't have printing press, so what did they do? They wrote books. Okay, we'll get back to this. Why they write books? They wrote books so they could learn, right? So they would write Chumashim on parchment. So they would have all of Breshit on a parchment or all of Shmot on a parchment. So in those books, you can finish even the middle of the page. But when it comes to the Torah, the whole Torah, Sefer Torah, you can't. Okay, that's the way they understand Rav right now. And that works well with the braita. But the Gemara now questions that and says, Ini, could that really be true? Because Hama Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba Amar Rav Gidal Amar Rav. Pay attention to who this is, because we brought Rabbi Yehoshua saying something in the name of Rav Gidal, saying something in the name of Rav, we're going to have two other statements he says about Torah, one about the Torah itself and one about a Sefer Torah and writing it. But two other statements by him that are going to come because we mentioned this one, we're going to mention two others. But anyway, right now, let's see the first statement. Le'enei kol Yisrael, which are the last words of the Torah, be'emtza hadaf. So he says, you could put it in the middle of the page. So there you have it. Rav clearly doesn't say that it's only if you have a Chumash. He seems to say at the end of the Torah. Okay, because he's saying the words Le'enei kol Yisrael at the end of the Torah, the end of Sefer Torah, can go in the middle of the page. So how are you going to explain that? Well, they come up with an explanation. Hahu be'emtza shita itmar. He actually meant in the middle of of the line, not in the middle of, and that actually works with Rashi, right? Where does it end up? That point at the bottom, in the middle of the line. We said it's centered. So what he means is you can end in the middle of the line, okay? Not in the middle of a page, okay? And that's how we explain Rav. Now, maybe not, okay? If we explain it that way, the simple reading, that he wasn't talking about the page at all, then we really could reconcile Rav with the braita, because we could say, when he said the middle of the page, he meant the Chumashim. And when he said Le'enei kol Yisrael in the middle, he meant in the middle of the line and not in the middle of the page. And then it all works together with the braita, Masechet Sofrim. But there's two interpretations of what Rav really meant, but when he said this, okay, be'emtza shita, when they explain this, Rav Gidal Amar Rav, Le'enei kol Yisrael be'emtza hadaf, okay, and then we explain it be'emtza shita, meaning in the middle of a row. It's two explanations, and each of the two explanations, there's two ways to understand it, which is going to be a little confusing, but when there's two completely different ways and there's ramifications, I like to bring it to you. So I hope I don't confuse you too much, but I think it's very interesting. So we're going to go first with the first interpretation, and then we'll switch. Rabbanan, we're going to read it twice, basically, and then explain the ramifications of each reading. Rabbanan Amrei, af be'emtza shita. So Rabbanan say, when he said, Le'enei kol Yisrael be'emtza shita, he means even be'emtza shita. According to this, that means, okay, we're going to read it the first way. Rav really means, when he says even in the middle of the line, means in the middle of the page, and even if you want in the middle of the line, which means that Rav actually disagrees with the braita, and then it kind of fits nicely, this interpretation, which how we started. Because Rav Yosef said there's two places where Rav spoke, and a braita completely contradicts him, and it sounds like there's no real answer. So, because he says tiyuvte, right? Tiyuvte is, there's no answer to the question. So this ends, if we go with the rabbi's understanding of what Rabbi Yehoshua quoted Rav Gidal saying in the name of Rav, is that even in the middle of a line you can end, and of course in the middle of a page. And then Rav seems to say you can end in the middle of the page, and the braita seems to say you can't. Complete contradiction. Now, how do we reconcile that before we get to Rav Ashi? How do you reconcile that? Because, right, the Rabbanan here is just rabbis who disagree with Rav Ashi. We don't know who they are. They're just unnamed rabbis. And that's how they understood Rav. And there's a concept about Rav. Rav is the first Emora, right? He's from the first generation, and he has status. He's very, very prominent. And they say Rav Tanahu Upalik. He has the status of a Tana, and he can disagree with Tana in position. So basically, Rav Yosef is saying here's some places where Rav disagrees, and according to that, it's okay because it's allowed to. As opposed to other people who don't really have the liberty to just say, I disagree with the Tana, okay, unless they have some other Tana to support them. Rav Ashi amal be'emtza shita dafka. Now it has to be, and that's be'emtza shita only. He didn't mean in the middle of the page. He only meant in the middle of the line. And then Rav fits with the braita. Okay, so we have a debate between the rabbis and Rav Ashi. Does he disagree with the braita or does he not disagree with the braita? That's the first reading. And just to finish it, before we go back and read the second reading, the hilchata be'emtza shita dafka. And the halacha is, it's specifically the middle of the line, which means you can't end, according to Rav, in the middle of the page. Everyone agrees it has to end at the end of the page, but it could end at the end of the line. Now, what's important here in the word that I just said? It could end at It could end in the middle of a line. Okay, you don't have to end at the end of the line. Now, that's saying you don't have to end at the middle of the line, but you could end it in the middle of the line, right? So there's two ramifications here of the way we read this, is that the rabbis who disagree with Rav Ashi think that Rav actually goes against the braita, and that when it says middle of the line, it means it's a pasuk, right? You could. Now we're going to read it the second way. Rabbanan Amre, now according to this interpretation, Rav agrees that it has to end at the end of the page, just like the rabbis said. We're not even talking about that anymore. When they say, and we thought that meant in the middle of the page, when the Gemara says, no, Hahiba emtza shita itmar, that means no, he was only talking about in the middle of the row. He wasn't, right, like in the middle of the column there, the center or something. But what he meant is, you don't have to end at the end of the line. Okay? That's what he means. You don't have to end at the end of the line. Okay. Now we're going to have two interpretations. This has nothing to do with the end of the page. End of the page, for sure he agrees with the braita. End of the page, it has to be. You must end the Sefer Torah on the last line. But Rabbanan say, af be'emtza shita, and Rav Ashi says, be'emtza shita dafka. One says, you could end in the middle of the line. And Rav Ashi says you have to end in the middle of the line. In fact, this is the way people rule, is that it has to be on the last line, and it has to end in the middle of the page. And that's why Rashi has it going angle down into the middle. The Rambam, middle of the page means it just can't end at the end of the line. In other words, you have to end it somewhere before. He doesn't care if it's all right, justified. It just has to end before the end of the line. Some people say the reason for this is because you want to make it clear that we're at the end, right? If you go to the end of the line, it could be, they just forgot to continue or something. But if you have it in the middle of the row and it's done there, like it seems very clear, this is the end. Okay, that's a possible way of looking at it. So these are two completely different readings, which have, right, reading the same words in two completely different ways, which have obvious, different ramifications. Okay, we're continuing. Amar Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba, I told you, since we quoted Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba, quoted Rav Gidal, quoted Rav, we're now going to have a few other statements he makes about Torahs. So on Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba, on Rav Gidal, and Rav, Shmona psukim, this is very famous, Shmona psukim Shabbat Torah. What 8 psukim are we talking about? The last 8 psukim of the Torah. What's unique about them? Well, they describe Moshe's death. Now, if Moshe wrote the Torah, we have a problem. How could he write that Moshe died? Right? We're describing something that happened and he's still alive. And also it's weird to think Moshe is going to write about his death. So, Yachid. So first of all, Rav Gidal or Rav Yehoshua is going to say in the name of Rav Gidal, in the name of Rav, that these 8 psukim have a different status than all the other psukim in the Torah. Yachid korei otam bebeit HaKnesset. An individual, I'm going to translate this literally, an individual reads them in the Beit Knesset, in the shul. Okay, what that means, many, many interpretations. I'm just going to go with one, but you can feel free to read up on other options. But that they can't be divided. Normally you can divide an aliyah as long as you have 3 psukim, right? Minimum 3 psukim for aliyah. This is 8 psukim, you can't break them up. one reader reads them. That's the way one of the interpretations is, right? Yachid, only one person can read these psukim. You can't split them up and divide them between two readers. But again, there's many other interpretations what this means. Whatever it means, it obviously means that these have a different status than the rest of the psukim in the Torah. Kiman. Who does this go according to? Deloka Rabbi Shimon. It seems like it doesn't accord with Rabbi Shimon's opinion. What is that? We're going to read right now. Tanya, as it says in a braita. Vayamat sham Moshe eved Hashem. Okay, so it says Moshe died there. If Shar Moshe made katav vayamat sham Moshe, could Moshe have written the words and Moshe dies? Ela ad kan katav Moshe, until that pasuk Moshe wrote. Mikam ela katav Yehoshua benu. We saw this also in Baba Batra. Who wrote what book, right? And says Moshe wrote the Torah, but Yehoshua filled it in the last day of psukim. This is Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Va'amri la Rabbi Nechemia. Either Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Nechemia said this. So that works fine, because why is only one person reading them, or whatever this unique law is? Because they weren't written by Moshe, so they have a different status, and only one reader can read them. We can't start dividing them up. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon, which is the opinion that doesn't seem to accord with this. If Shar Sefer Torah Chaser Ot Echad, could it be the Sefer Torah is missing one letter and it's valid? Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, Uchtiv lakoch et Sefer Torah as nevasam moto. Moshe starts talking about take this Sefer Torah as if this Sefer Torah existed. Now, if Moshe didn't write the last day of psukim, then what is he holding? He's holding something that's missing. If it's missing words, it can't be a kosher Sefer Torah. So it can't possibly be. Must be Moshe wrote them. How did this work? Well, Ela ad kan HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer Moshe kotev. Until that point, those last 8 psukim, God dictated it and Moshe wrote it. Ve'omer, and he also said it out loud. Mikam va'elach, from those 8 psukim and on to the end, HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer Moshe kotev b'dema. God writes it, and Moshe writes it, doesn't say it out loud, okay, doesn't repeat the words, he just writes it b'dema. Okay, what b'dema means, there's also a lot of interpretation. Some people explain it as with tears, b'dma'ot, and he was crying. Some people say actually that it was written with tears. The tears made the writing, okay? Say, how could you say that? It needs ink. Anyway, there's a big debate about what this means, but clearly it was written by Moshe, just in a bit of a different way than everything else. So now, and then we're going to quote a pasuk, Kamosh Ne'emar La'alan. This idea of dictating and somebody writing appears also in this pasuk, in Yirmiyahu, Vayom Alehem Baruch, Mipiv Yikra Elai Et Kol HaDvarim Ha'eleh, V'ani Kotev Al HaSefer B'dio. Some people say this is Yirmiyahu, well, it's clearly Yirmiyahu, who dictates to Baruch his Sofer, to write down. We'll explain this is Echad that he was writing, okay? And again, it's actually very similar, because writing about the destruction before it actually happened. I believe it was before it happened. Anyway, the point being that there's this idea of dictation, and that's what happened with God and Moshe. Now, so they say, Limited Loka Rabbi Shimon, right? Because then these don't have a different status, Moshe wrote them. To which they say, what do you mean? Rabbi Shimon, no, even if they were written by Moshe, they were written differently than all the rest of the Torah. So you could say, still, even according to this interpretation, it has a unique halacha. Again, however, we did explain what this unique halacha is. We explained it one way. There's other multiple interpretations, but it does have a unique status, even though they were all written by Moshe. So you could explain it both ways. Okay, third statement of Rabbi Yehoshua bar Abba Amar Rav Gidal Amar Rav. Halokech Sefer Torah min ashuk. It's a very interesting one. If you take a Sefer Torah, meaning you buy it from the shuk, okay, now they're not really focusing on buying it in the marketplace, right? It seems like a weird place to go buy a Sefer Torah, but they just mean if you buy a Sefer Torah, kechotef mitzvah min ashuk. It's like you're stealing a mitzvah from the shuk. Okay, what does that mean? It means that you're missing a huge opportunity. Okay, why? Because you should be writing a Sefer Torah and not reading a Sefer Torah. Okay, so basically, we're going to say, if you buy a Sefer Torah and you don't write it yourself, or equal to writing it yourself is what? Hiring a scribe to write it for you, okay? Because a scribe is, because we'd say shlucho shel adam kamoto, okay? If you can't write it yourself, but you hire someone to write it, that's as if you did it yourself. But basically, we're going to say, if you do that, it's like you're missing a huge opportunity for a mitzvah. Now, but kitavo, if you write it yourself, but if you write it, it's as if you got it at Har Sinai. Okay, writing a Sefer Torah, this obviously they brought this up also because Moshe wrote the Torah, and it's like we're writing the Torah ourselves. Okay, there's a interesting thing here about machlokah between the Rambam and Rashi. Rashi basically says if you buy a Sefer Torah, it's fine. It's just you're missing a big opportunity. It's not a bad thing, even though kichotef sounds like a bad thing. Usually that's like stealing. So Rashi views this as not not a bad thing. It's just not ideal. You should really write it. But the Rambam basically says that this is the wrong way to do it. Okay? He says this is mamash a bad thing. You should not be writing it. You should not be buying it. Okay? I just want to... 1 second. Right. Right. It's mashma from the Rambam, they say. Okay? And they say it's really a debate between is the Ikar mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah or is the Ikar mitzvah that you will have a Sefer Torah. So if you view the Ikar mitzvah as writing a Sefer Torah, then you're not going to get that mitzvah if you buy it, because buying it is not the same as writing it. But if you say the main thing is to have a Sefer Torah, maybe there's a more ideal way to do it, which is writing it yourself. But if you buy it, you still, at least you have a Sefer Torah. You have to remember, in those days, they didn't have a printing press, right? Writing the Sefer Torah was so that you have it to learn from. But it could be the learning process is by writing it and not by, right? Which nowadays is hard to imagine, right? Because we just have everything printed and we write very little. But anyway, it's an interesting debate, again, which has serious ramifications. What exactly is the mitzvah? Is it to write? Is it to have? And that affects how you read this sugya. Is it just not ideal, or is it really a bad thing to do? Or, completely not fulfilling the mitzvah. Amar Rav Sheshet, or Rav Sheshet adds here, if you take a Sefer Torah that's ruined and you fix one letter, it's as if you wrote it, because you're turning a Sefer Torah into something that was disqualified to being, valid. Okay, Siman Seglam, this is just Siman for the next section. Now we're going to start talking about the margins of the Sefer Torah. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, Ose Adam Yiriyah, Mi bat shalosh dapim va'ad bat shmona dapim. How big should the pieces of parchment be? Because what's Sefer Torah? It's sewn parts of parchment together, right? It's just pieces of parchment. Now they're going to define them by columns. How many columns should a piece of parchment fill? It should be between 3 and 8. Don't do more than 8. Don't do a piece of parchment that can fit more than 8 columns. And don't do less than 3. Okay? Now we're going to see. Okay, now besides the size, and there's different explanations given for the size. When you roll a Torah, you're supposed to roll it by the stitches, so it won't really work if it's too long. And if it's too short, then it's just not nice looking. Every 2 seconds you see stitches. That's not respectful. So this is like the in-between. We give a range, which is interesting. They give a range and don't make it very, like many things are very precise. This is just a range. Now they say, don't put in too many columns. Like, let's say, okay, you have that size. It fits 8, but don't squish in 10 columns, because then they're going to be very narrow and it looks like you're writing a letter. That's the way a letter is written, not the way a scroll is written. Again, it's hard for us to understand this because we don't write letters in the days that they did and the way they write them, but obviously letters are written more narrow. Don't put too few columns in that space and make really long columns. This we can relate to because, right, you lose where you're up to, right? If you get, by the time you get to the end of the line and then you go back, you're not sure. You're on line 4, 5, right? It gets very confusing. Ela kigon. So now they tell you how long should the line be, and here's a great way they tell you how long the line should be. Lemishpachotechem shalosh pamim. They take one of the longest letters words there are, 10 letters, a 10-letter word, and they say take the word lemishpachotechem, write it 3 times, 30 letters, and that's as long as your column should be. It sounds very short, but I looked, like I Googled just, Sefer Torah and saw a picture and I counted and there's really 30 words in a column. It doesn't look so short. Somehow thinking of just 3 words, but they're 3 very long words. So that's really the length of the column. What if you end up with a piece of parchment that's 9 columns long? What do you do? Well, you have to split it. But don't do 3 and 6. Do 4 and 5. Okay. Big debate about how to understand this, although it's not as interesting as some of the other ones we talked about today. But either it means if you're going to put the 2 right next to each other, put them evenly sized. Okay, they don't use halves really in those days, so that's why they said 4 and 5. They could have said 4 and a half, but they didn't. But that's the idea. If they're going to be right next to each other, you don't want really big one and then next to a really small one. Some people say just 4 and 5 is just a better amount than 3 and 6. And 3 is fine, but it's like at the edge, right? That's the minimum. So better to keep in general, they just look nicer when they're a little bit longer. When do we have to take note of all these things and like how the columns should be and how wide? B'tchilat sefer. That's in the beginning of the book, what they really mean, the entire book, other than the last page. Aval b'sefer sefer, we already discussed this, you have to get to the bottom. You're not always going to get there, right? Because you might have very few words. How are you going to get to the bottom of the page? Afilu pasuk echad v'afilu daf echad. Even one pasuk and even one column. So it's unclear exactly what they mean. One pasuk and one column. It sounds like you could take one pasuk and go all the way to the end of the column. Anyway, they're going to say, pasuk echad sakadatach. What, you think you could take one pasuk and write all the way at the end of the column? That's not, first of all, it doesn't fit with what we saw earlier. You have to finish at the end of the page. What they meant to say is you could have one verse on one page. What you're going to do is you're going to make, right, you're going to somehow stretch, you're going to change the size of the font and change the, right, you're going to basically somehow make sure that is going to basically go all the way down to the bottom of the page. So you might need to make the rows wider, the letters bigger, depending on how much you have left, to get it to go to the bottom. Shi'ur gilayom. Okay, what are the margins? Classic question, right? What are the margins of a typical piece of paper? What are the margins of a typical Sefer Torah? Milamata tefach, from the bottom, tefach of space, hand breadths, right? That's 4 fingers. Milamala shalosh etzbaot, at the top, 3. Okay, this is because at the bottom you might touch it, and we don't want you touching the letters. I think that's what the reason is. Bein daf ledaf kimalo revach rochav shtei etzbaot, between each column, 2 fingers, right? So the width of 2 fingers. Okay, now if you're doing just one book of the Torah, the laws are a little more lenient in terms of your margins. Milamata shalosh etzbaot, from the bottom, 3 finger breadths instead of 4. Milamala shtei etzbaot, 2 instead of 3. Ubein daf ledaf kimalo revach rochav gudal. It's 1 finger breadth, but as opposed to 2, but it's one of the thumb, which is thicker than one regular one. Ubein shita l'shita kimalo shita. This just basically means double spaced in between the lines. Okay, in between the lines, a complete line. Ubein teva l'teva, in between word to word, kimalo ot ktana, just the size of a yud. Okay, the smallest letter, that's the space in between words. Ubein od la'ot kimalo chut hasara. Between letters, it has to be, right, just a teeny space. As long as they're not touching, that's sufficient. Al yimeit adam et haktav. Don't change the size of the font. Lo mipnei revach shamata v'lo mipnei revach shamala v'lo mipnei revach shaben shita l'shita. What if you didn't leave enough margin at the top? You didn't leave enough margin at the bottom. So you'll say, I'll just make the letters smaller. Or you didn't leave enough in between rows. It wasn't double spaced. No. It's more important to keep the size of the font the same than it is to have the margins as we described. So if you have a little less in the margin or a little less between the rows, it's fine. And also not to between parshiot. There's different parshiot, right? Not even parsha the way we call them parsha, but sections. Also between sections, you don't need to fix the letters so that it's all to change the spacing there. What if you're writing a word and you're toward the end of the line? You have 5 letters left and you can't fit them all in the margin. Okay, because remember there's space in between each column. So lo yechtov shtayim b'toch hadaf v'shalosh chutz l'daf. Don't write 2 on the line and 3 in the margin. Ela shalosh b'toch hadaf v'shtayim chutz l'daf. Okay, so this sounds like you actually might be able to shrink the letters a little bit, make them a little narrower, so that you get 3 letters within the margin, within the column, and only 2 jut out. So you could have things jutting out of the column. We're now at Amud Bet. If you have a word that's 2, now we just said that you could you could overflow kind of into the margin in between the row and the columns by 2 letters. So what if you have a 2-letter word like et, al, all those words, pen, okay? If you have a word that's 2 otiot and you're at the end of a line, completely at the end of a line, now you have these 2 letters, you might have thought you could put it in the margin because you could put 2 letters in a margin. No. Don't put it in between the columns. If it's a new word, then put it on the next line. Only if it's continuing a word, then you're allowed to go extra. Right? You imagine just being in word, right? And you want to fit this on the line. You don't want to go to the next line, right? So you stretch the line a little bit, or right? There's a lot of you stretch the margin. Okay. Now we're going to get into what if you make. This is our last sugya really, and from here we're going to get off on a big tangent. Okay. If you make a mistake in the name of Hashem, and let's say you forget Shem Hashem, so what do? We're going to see 5 different opinions about how you resolve this problem. First opinion, and we're going to have a wide range. Okay, you'll see. This is one extreme. Gorer et mashkatav, whatever the word that was written right next to it, scrape the way the ink. Completely scrape it as if it's clean. Okay? Tole et mashagaral. Now you can add something in the margin above. That's why we have it double spaced. So if you make a mistake, you can write it in above. But you can't write Shem Hashem above. So you have to completely scrape out a word, put in the name of God there, and put the word that you erased in the space in between the rows, right? Like we do an upside down V. If you were writing, we don't write so much anymore, but if you were writing and you skipped something, right, when I was a kid and we wrote assignments for school, right? So you would do a little this and add a word on top. That's what you could do, but not Shem Hashem. And you write God's name on the erased part. But again, it's not really erased, it's scraped off. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi Omer. Now we're on the other extreme. Af tolim et Hashem. You can even put the name of God up above. Okay? Rabbi Yitzchak Amar. Here's some in-between opinion. Af mochek v'kotev. You can erase. Okay, if the ink is still wet, you can erase it. Now what's the issue here? Well, it's a little smudged. So you can erase the other word, write the name of God on that, even though it's a little smudged and it might not be as clear. You don't have to scrape it necessarily. And then write the name of God in, and again, put the word that you took out on in between the rows. Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, remember him because we're going to come, the whole tangent's all about him. Rabbi Shimon Shizuri Omer, Kol Hashem Kulo Talin, Mikzato Ein Tolin. He kind of holds like Rabbi Yossi. You could put the name of God in between the rows, but he says only the complete name of God. If let's say you have half the name of God missing, so don't put in 2 letters of the name of God on the upper line and 2 in the regular line, 2 in between and 2 regular. No, that's not appropriate. As long as the whole name of God is included in that, upside down V and, section above, that works, but not part of the name of God. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Omer Mishum Rabbi Meir, Ein kotvim et Hashem, lo amakom agrar, velo amakom amachat, ve'ein tolim oto. Okay, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, you can't do anything that we said. Okay, so what do you do? Ketzad oseh, misaleket riyah kula v'gonza. The only thing you can do is take out this piece of parchment. Okay, if it was sewn on, unsew it, take it out, start with a new one, and put that in the geniza. Okay, there's no way to fix leaving out the name of God. Now we're going to move on to our next section, which really is part of this section, but, well, actually in a minute. But first we're going to start with Itmar Rav Hanan al Amarav. First we're going to have a psikat halacha here. Okay, actually we're not yet moving. My confusion. Rav Hanan al Amarav, halachat tolin et Hashem. He paskins like Rabbi Yossi. You can leave the name of God up in between the row. You can just add it in. You don't have to start erasing or anything else. Rabbi Baruch Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Shmuel, halacha mochek v'kotev. You can erase it. Right, remember, smudge it a little, right? Even though it's smudged, and write the name of God in there. And again, don't put the name of God in the margins there, in between the rows. Put a different word. So now they say, why don't they just say, he holds like Rabbi Yossi, he holds like Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay, that would have been a better way to say it. So they say no, and that's usually the way to say it, right? When some rabbi comes along and says, I hold this way, they should say, I hold by this person. They said mishum da'ab chaluhu, because some people think that different rabbis said different things. There are different versions as to who said what, and that's why they said the bottom line of what they paskin and not who said it. Now we're going to get to that section that moves us into something else, which is Amar Rav and Bar Chanina, Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Chanina. So Rav and Bar Chanina quotes Ula, who quotes Rabbi Chanina saying, Halacha ke Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. We paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. And the second thing he said is V'lo od ela kol makom sheshana Rabbi Shimon Shizuri halacha k'moto. And not only that, but every single time Rabbi Shimon Shizuri comes up, we paskin like him. So now the Gemara wants to ask a question. Now, because we're reading this in our sugya, what do we assume it means? It means we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri here, who said you can be tolim, you can put it in between the name of God, in between the rows, as long as it's the whole name of God. Okay, that's what we thought. And then he points out, and by the way, we always hold like him. But now the Gemara is saying, this was quoted from somewhere, we don't know where it's quoted from. We don't know what case, Ahaya, on what case is he referring to when he starts out saying the halacha here is like Rabbi Shimon Shizuri, and by the way, in every other place as well. So we want to figure out what's the here. Is here, our sugya, or is it somewhere else? And every time we're going to quote, we're not going to have an answer yet today, every time we quote something, we're going to suggest it's perhaps this opinion of Rabbi Shimon Shizuri. We're going to see that basically there was a list of rabbis who paskind, and this Rabbi Chanina, or Rav and Bar Chanina quoting Rabbi Chanina, is not present there in the discussion. So if he really did say the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Chazuri, he should have been listed there with the others who were paskening halacha. So it must be he didn't pasken in that case directly, because if he did, his name would have been there. Which, take it or leave it, that argument, right? It's not the most convincing. It could be just whoever put it together didn't know that he said it, but that's the theory. The theory is, and every time we're going to quote all different opinions of Rabbi Shimon Chazuri, we're going to say, if really he said it there, well then why is his name not there? Okay, now, I want you to start thinking, because we're going to quote all different sugyas of Rabbi Shimon Chazuri, of a theory that binds all these psikot of Rabbi Shimon Chazuri. Okay, so the first one is our case, writing a Sefer Torah, missing the name of God. What do? He comes up with a solution. You can put it in between the rows, but just as long as it's the whole name of God. Okay, so now we're going to say Ahaya. Which one? If it's this one that he said it about at first, Rabbi Shimon Chazuri Omer Kol Hashem Kulo Tolim, Miksato Ein Tolim, exactly what we learned. You can put the name of God in between the lines, but only the whole name. But we just learned, it was said, Amar Rav Chanan Al Amar Rav Halacha Tolim Tashem, Rav Bar Chanan Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel Halacha Mochek V'Kotev. And if he really had a psika here that we pass like Rabbi Shimon Chazuri, Hunami Lema, he would have also said it here. We would have had it in the sugya, so it must not be that one. Let's try the second one. Ela aha. Okay, this is a very strange halacha. There's something called a ben pekua. We're going to learn about it further on in Chulin. If you slaughter an animal that's pregnant and there's a offspring inside and it survives, then you don't have to, and the animal's alive, you don't have to slaughter that animal to eat it. It's kosher even without slaughtering. It's crazy halacha. Like you can eat an animal without slaughtering it. And comes Rabbi Shimon Chazuri and he says the following. Rabbi Shimon Chazuri Omer, afilu ben chamesh shanim, even if it's 5 years old, v'choresh basadeh, and is plowing in the fields, shchitat imo metarto, the fact that its mother was slaughtered and it was inside at the time, permits it entirely. So you could just kill the animal, regular, and eat the animal. Okay? That's his first halacha. This one I couldn't really fit into the theory as much. But the others, I think I have a theory about what's similar about them. You'll probably agree with me. I think it's kind of obvious, but you can maybe come up with your own. Anyway, it can't be that one, because I itmar ala ze'eri amar Rabbi Chanina halacha ke Rabbi Shimon Chazuri v'im ita hunami lema. Again, we have ze'eri. Now, in this case, it's a little bit weird, because ze'eri says it in the name of Rabbi Chanina. So it is said in the name of Rabbi Chanina that we paskin like Rabbi Shimon Chazuri, but I think what they're saying is since ze'eri quoted it, we would have also heard from Rav and Bar Chanina who said in the name of Ula also that Rabbi Chanina said. The other ones are going to be other people paskening, and just why isn't he there? This one's a little weird because Rabbi Chanina is there, but not quoted by the people who quote him here. So he was missing here, and therefore it doesn't make sense he said it there. Ela aha, maybe this one. Barishona hayom boim. Now we're in the laws of get. And when it comes to a get, someone can send a get through a messenger. Someone can also tell a messenger, write and give a get to my wife. Okay? So we can send people to write the get and give the get. We learned this in Gittin, there's all these rules, how many people need to do it. Anyway, whatever. This whole thing about writing, write and give the get. If someone just says, write a get to my wife, they can't go ahead and give it unless the husband says, give it, unless it's in certain unique circumstances. So, hayotze b'kolar, they're about to kill you. Okay, this was the way the Romans killed people. They're about to kill someone, execute. V'amar kitvu get lishti, and he says, go write a get to my wife. What's the issue? Well, he's going to die. What does she need to get? Well, maybe he has no kids, and she's going to have to yibum with his brother, and he wants to prevent her from doing that, so he says, I want you to divorce her. But he doesn't say, he says, write a get, but he didn't say give it. Okay? You can write the get and give it, because he obviously meant it. He was just a little worked up that he was about to be killed, executed, so he didn't say the whole thing, but obviously he meant give it to my wife. Chazru lamar, after they said this halacha, they said, you know what? Same thing for someone who's traveling far away, because they're worried about a guna, right? What if they go and they never come back and their wife won't? So they say, write a get to my wife, but they're busy, getting ready before their trip. They're all worked up, so they say, well, I better. Like the assumption is he meant to say write and give, he just didn't say it. Rabbi Shimon Chazuri Omer Afa Mesukan, even someone who's very sick. Same thing. They just weren't focused enough to say kitvu v'tznu, so you can give the get even without making sure that was really what he meant. Like, let's say he's very sick and then he gets so sick that you can't ask him anymore. Did you mean give it to my wife? So they give it, right? In the case where they went abroad, they're not here anymore to say it. Okay? So you can give the get. Inamiyaha, so it could be on that one, or it could be on this one. Trumat ma'asel shel demai shechazra limkoma, Rabbi Shimon Chizuri Omer, Af b'chol sho'alo v'achlo people. Okay, let's try to explain some background. When you buy from an Am Haaretz, someone who's not trusted, they're not trusted in certain things. What are they not trusted in? Well, we know they do truma really, because that's doraita, but they don't always take the maaser. Okay? Now, if they didn't take the maaser, if you buy produce, you have to take the maaser out, and then you have to take truma from the maaser. So that's the Levite has to basically give truma. So when you're separating it, you separate the maaser and the truma maaser. Now, what if, so you bought this produce from an Am Haaretz, you're not sure, maybe they took maaser out, maybe they didn't. So you take it just in case. Then you basically, by accident, the truma that you took, which is forbidden for you to eat now because it's truma, falls back in the batch with all the produce. And it now ruins all your produce because everything is suffix truma. So what do? So he says, if it got mixed in, now, in this case, there's a chance that the Am Haaretz actually did take masrot. You just don't know. Now, in general, we don't trust an Am Haaretz to answer. So we don't ask an Am Haaretz. The only times we allow you to ask is on Shabbat, because on Shabbat you can't fix it. So we allow you to ask the Am Haaretz, did you take Trumot Masrot? And if they say yes, then you can eat it. Some people say because they won't lie on Shabbat, which is an interesting theory, or just because you're stuck, so we'll allow it on Shabbat. Now comes Rabbi Shimon and says, in this case, it's like Shabbat, basically. And he says, even bechol, okay, bechol sho'alov, af bechol sho'alov achlo apiv. Even on a weekday, you can ask the Am Haaretz, and if the Am Haaretz said, oh yeah, of course I took Trumot Masrot, you can believe them and permit the whole thing, because now your Trumot Maser, what you did, it's not really Truma, because you didn't need to do Truma. So basically, you can undo the Truma, and then you can eat the rest of it. Okay, so maybe it's those two. But it was said on these things, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, both these things, halachak, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri b'mesukan u'b'truma Maser shel Tamai. And again, here we're quoting Rabbi Yochanan saying this, Im ita unami lema, and if Rabbi Chanina said it also, he would have been listed here. Ela aha, how about this one? Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur, Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, Pola mislish ezra'o lezera, mikzato ishrish lefnei Rosh Hashanah, mikzato ishrish achar Rosh Hashanah. So the moment of determining what is old and what is new when it comes to items that are planted for the seeds, as opposed to items that are planted for eating. Items that are planted for eating, the obligation of Truma and Maser kicks in at the time you harvest it. But if you're planting them for the seeds, because you want to plant more seeds, or you want to eat the seeds even, you want to eat them as seeds and not as what's growing from them, then the moment that your Chayav and Trumot Masrot kicks in, and the determining factor for what we're going to see is it this year's produce or last year's, which we'll see in a minute what the relevance is, kicks in when it takes root. So now what happened? You planted this not so much before Rosh Hashanah. Some took root this year and some took root in the next year. And now when you go later to take the Trumot Masrot, you have a problem. Why? Because Ein Tormim Mizalzeh. You can't take Truma from old produce on new produce, or new produce on old produce, as it says, Lefisha Ein Tormim v'Maslim min hachadash al yashan u'min yashan al chadash. So what are you going to do? You have no way to take Trumot Masrot, because you don't know what's new, you don't know what's old. It all grew together, and some took root before, some took root after, some are part of this year, some are part of the next year, some are part of the previous year, some are part of the new year. So Ketzad Yaseh, what do? So Ver Gorno Litocho, V'nimtza Torem u'Maser min hachadash shebo al hachadash shebo, u'min yashan shebo al yashan shebo. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says, here's your solution: gather everything together, mix it all up, like make a big mush. Right? I was thinking of play Rummy Cube. Right? When after you finish a game, you have to mix it really well, or a deck of cards. Right? You have to mix them really well, so it's you have a complete nice mix. Then take some. And the assumption is whatever you take is going to have a mix of new and old. So the new stuff you took is going to cover your new stuff, and your old stuff is going to cover the old stuff, and that's your solution. Okay, so maybe it's that one. But again, Ha'itmar Alam, Rabbi Shimon bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Halacha, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and again, Im Ita Hu Nami Lema, and he should be there. So we're going to stop here, because the next one is just going to suggest another one about a Shida, and then they're going to explain what that is. Or Yayin, okay, we'll get to that tomorrow. So, what's our issue? Okay, let's just try to come up with a theory of Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. At least for what I could see, is Shimon Shazuri is the problem solver. Right? You have an issue, and some people say, sorry, halachic problem, there's no way out. And Rabbi Shimon Shazuri tries to find a halachic way out of all these things, and he tries to come up with a solution so a woman doesn't become an aguna or have to do yibum, right? He comes up with a solution so that You don't ruin all your produce. Okay, these are all ways of coming up with solutions. The Pempekua doesn't exactly fit the bill, but you forgot to put the Shem Hashem, so if you just put it in the line above, you don't need to make yourself crazy and erase and scrape and this and that. Okay, so what did we do today? We started with the other statement of Rav that had a braita that contradicted. We ended up saying it wasn't really clear if in the end he does contradict the braita or not. Is there a debate about whether you have to finish at the bottom line, or you can finish actually in the middle? And then we saw that you really have to finish in the middle of the line, or maybe you can finish in the middle of the line depending on how you read it. Okay, then we went to these other two statements. In the middle of that sugya, we quote the statement of Rabbi Shimon bar Abba in the name of Rav Gidal in the name of Rav. We quoted the one about the 8 psukim in the Torah, the last ones. They have a different status. Either which way, whether Yehoshua wrote them or Moshe wrote them. We had the second statement about buying a Sefer Torah from the shuk. You're not really fulfilling the mitzvah properly, or maybe not at all, because really the mitzvah is to write the Sefer Torah. Then we got into all the how large your parchment should be, how big the margin should be, how the letters, how they should be organized, all those things, how much can you go into the margin. Then we got into, if you forgot the name of God, what are the 5 possible solutions, or maybe there is no solution. Number 5 is, you can't even fix it. And then we saw how we paskin, and then we had this thing about Rabbi Hanina paskins like Rabbi Shimon Chazuri in something, and then says, and everything else as well. And we're just trying to figure out what was the something, which case was was the one where he actually paskined it directly, and then from there drew the rule. And we're in the middle of figuring that out. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.